The morning my mother went into surgery, my brother handed me a note that changed everything. I woke before my alarm that morning, pulled from sleep by a strange heaviness I couldn't shake. The house felt unusually still, as if it sensed the day waiting ahead of us. I sat on the edge of my bed, rubbing my palms together, listening to the distant hum of the refrigerator. Even the air felt colder, brushing against my skin in a way that made me tighten my shoulders before the sun had fully risen over our quiet street. I moved through the hallway slowly, feeling the wooden floor creak beneath each step. My mother's bedroom door was cracked open, a thin line of light spilling across the carpet like a reminder of how fragile everything felt. She was already awake, sitting upright, hands folded in her lap. Her breathing was steady, but her eyes carried a seriousness I wasn't used to seeing. It struck me how small she looked in that moment as the morning slowly settled around her. She smiled when she noticed me, but it was a faint smile, the kind someone gives when they're more focused on staying brave than expressing comfort. I walked closer, feeling my throat tighten as I took in the pale color of her cheeks. The hospital instructions sat neatly beside her purse, folded with her usual precision. I reached for them without thinking. The paper felt cool and smooth, almost out of place in such an emotionally charged room, like something 80. I helped her into her coat, the soft fabric brushing against my arms as I steadied her. The weight of the day pressed against my chest, making each breath feel slightly tighter. She moved slowly but with a determination I had seen throughout my life. When she whispered that she was ready, her voice carried a tremble she tried to hide. I nodded, pretending not to notice, pretending I was stronger than I felt as we stepped into the morning. The drive to the hospital was quiet, interrupted only by the soft hum of the engine and the muffled rustle of her coat when she shifted. I glanced at her every few seconds, memorizing the slope of her shoulders and the way she kept her hands clasped tightly. The rising sun cast a pale glow across her face, highlighting the strain she tried so hard to hide. I held the steering wheel a little tighter, grounding myself in the motions. When we reached the parking lot, I felt a wave of cold air rush in as I opened her door. She leaned on my arm as we walked toward the entrance, her steps slower than usual but steady. The scent of disinfectant drifted out as the automatic doors opened, wrapping us in that familiar sterile chill. I felt her fingers tighten around my wrist for a moment, as if she needed reassurance. I squeezed gently, unsure who I was comforting. The waiting area was nearly empty, just a few scattered chairs and a television murmuring in the background. I guided her to a seat near the window where the light felt softer. She lowered herself carefully, exhaling a long breath that trembled slightly. I watched her shoulders rise and fall, noticing how fatigue pressed against her posture. She tried to smile again, and I returned it, even though my chest tightened. The quiet around us made the room settle softly. A nurse eventually approached us, her shoes whispering across the polished floor. She greeted my mother warmly and went over a few final details, her voice calm and steady. I tried to focus on her words, but my attention kept drifting to the subtle tremor in my mother's hands. When the nurse stepped away, my mother rested her palms on her knees, grounding herself. I could feel the weight of her effort, the way she steadied her breathing to keep 80. When they finally called her name, something inside me tightened, a mix of fear and urgency I couldn't swallow. She touched my arm lightly before standing, her fingers cool against my skin. I helped her rise, noticing the slight hesitation in her movements. As we walked toward the double doors, the fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. She paused briefly, taking in a slow breath, then gave me a small nod. I watched her disappear behind the doors, feeling strangely suspended 80. I sat back down in the waiting area, feeling the chair cushion sink beneath me with a softness that didn't match my nerves. The room felt too big and too quiet all at once. A vending machine hummed in the corner, the sound vibrating faintly through the stillness. I clasped my hands together, noticing how cold my fingers felt. The morning had only just begun, yet it already carried a weight I wasn't prepared to hold, settling over me like warmth. Time moved strangely after my mother disappeared behind the surgical doors, stretching and folding in on itself in a way that made every minute feel heavier. I sat in the waiting room with my hands clasped, listening to the distant echo of announcements drifting through the hall. The fluorescent lights above flickered ever so slightly, casting a faint shimmer across the tile floor that made the room feel colder. I tried to steady my breathing, but my chest tightened each time I imagined her lying on that operating table. I kept replaying our last look, searching for reassurance that morning. Across the room, a coffee machine sputtered weakly, releasing a thin stream of steam that faded before it reached the air vents. The warm scent didn't comfort me the way it usually might. Instead, it reminded me of sleepless nights spent worrying about things I couldn't control. I rubbed my thumb along the edge of my phone, debating whether to call my brother and ask where he was. He had been distant all morning, barely saying anything during the drive. Each small silence from him had settled like dust in the air, noticeable but unspoken in moments that felt heavier. When the automatic doors opened with a soft hiss, I looked up expecting to see a nurse or a volunteer stepping out. Instead, my brother walked in, moving with a stiffness that made his posture look unfamiliar. His eyes scanned the room before landing on me, and something in his expression made my stomach tighten. He approached quietly, the soles of his shoes tapping gently against the floor, each step measured. There was a folded piece of paper in his hand, creased so sharply it looked like he had been gripping it for a long time without letting himself breathe. He didn't sit beside me. Instead, he stopped just a few inches away, his shoulders slightly hunched as if he were shielding himself from something I couldn't see. The morning light from the windows cast a pale glow across his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw. He held out the paper slowly, not meeting my eyes. I reached for it with hesitation, feeling the dry texture of the folded edges against my fingertips. His breathing sounded uneven, almost too shallow, as though he was preparing for a reaction he couldn't predict in a room filled with waiting and quiet. I unfolded the paper slowly, though part of me was afraid of what I might find. The creases resisted at first, as if they had been pressed together with intention. My brother shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his movements restless. I caught a faint scent of cold air clinging to his jacket, as though he had been outside longer than he claimed. The writing on the paper wasn't immediately visible. The folds hid most of the text. I hesitated, sensing that whatever waited inside would alter the tone of the day entirely in ways I feared. My brother finally sat down, but not beside me. He chose a chair across the aisle, creating a space between us that felt sharper than any argument we had ever had. His knee bounced slightly, betraying nerves he didn't acknowledge. The morning sun shifted across the windows, casting long streaks of light across the floor. I could hear distant footsteps in the hallway, but he didn't react to any of them. His gaze stayed fixed on a point near his shoes, as though looking at me might reveal something he wasn't ready to confront in that fragile morning air still. I looked back at the paper, feeling its weight in a way that had nothing to do with its size. The faint sound of a cart rolling down the hallway echoed somewhere behind me, blending with the quiet murmur of the television in the corner. I unfolded the final crease, finally revealing the writing inside. My pulse picked up as the letters came into focus. My brother exhaled shakily, the sound barely audible but unmistakably strained. I didn't read the message yet. Instead, I let the moment breathe around me, holding its tension as the room waited with me quietly. The paper trembled slightly between my fingers, though I wasn't sure whether it was my hands shaking or the weight of the morning settling deeper into my body. My brother's posture stiffened as he watched me. His shoulders pressed tight, his expression closed off. The room hummed with a low, steady vibration from overhead lights, blending with the soft rustle of magazines on a nearby table. I could feel the air cooling around us, thinning in a way that sharpened every breath. I knew the moment I read the message, something in me would shift permanently in that quiet moment. When I finally closed the note and tucked it into my jacket pocket, I felt an ache rising in my chest that I couldn't name. I didn't read it yet, not fully, but seeing even a few familiar words had shaken something loose inside me. I leaned back in the hospital chair, letting the stiff fabric press against my shoulders as I tried to steady myself. The hum of the ventilation system filled the silence, a steady white noise that made it easier to drift backward into memories I hadn't revisited in years. I didn't plan to go there, but the morning had already opened a door I couldn't close. Growing up, things between my brother and me weren't always complicated. There were summers filled with bike rides on cracked sidewalks, afternoons chasing each other through the backyard, and quiet evenings when we'd fall asleep watching reruns on the old box TV our mother kept until it finally gave out. Back then, he looked up to me. Not in a dramatic way, just in the small gestures of a little brother who trusted someone to lead the way. I taught him how to tie his shoes, how to skip rocks, how to keep secrets from kids at school who didn't understand him. Childhood felt simple even though life around us wasn't. Our mother worked long hours at a grocery store, walking home when the bus ran late. I still remember the way she'd collapse onto the couch with a soft sigh, her hair damp from the humidity of summer nights. She would smile at us through her exhaustion as if being home was enough to replenish her. My brother was always the first to curl up beside her, seeking comfort in a way that never fully left him. He needed her in ways I didn't always understand. I tended to step back, learning early on to take care of myself so she could focus on him when he faltered. There were signs, even then, that he struggled more deeply than I realized. Small ones at first, things borrowed and never returned, stories that didn't quite add up, apologies that came too quickly or not at all. I remember once finding one of my allowance envelopes hidden under his bed, though he swore he had no idea how it got there. I believed him, mostly because I wanted to. Back then, trusting him felt easier than questioning him. I didn't want to be the kind of sibling who caused trouble, especially when our mother already carried so much on her shoulders. As we grew older, those little cracks in his honesty widened in ways I didn't always notice. Middle school was especially hard for him. He struggled with classes, often withdrawing or lashing out when teachers pushed him too hard. Our mother attended countless meetings, always trying to advocate for him, always trying to keep him from slipping through the cracks. I remember how tired she looked after those meetings, her purse slipping from her shoulder, her voice low as she described how misunderstood he felt. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how. I was just a kid, too focused on my own attempts to stay invisible. Yet despite all that, there were moments that made me believe he'd eventually find his footing. He'd help neighbors shovel their driveways in winter without being asked. He'd make our mother laugh with some silly joke when she came home crying from another long shift. He had a softness to him that made people underestimate the storms brewing inside him. Even now, sitting in that hospital waiting room, I could still picture him at 12 years old, kneeling on the living room floor trying to fix our wobbly coffee table with a toy screwdriver. He wanted so badly to be helpful, but he rarely finished what he started. High school changed things more drastically than anything else. He found new friends, kids who felt like outsiders just like him, but their influence wasn't always good. I noticed him coming home later, smelling faintly of cigarette smoke, with excuses that stretched thin the moment they left his mouth. Our mother worried, though she tried not to show it. I could see the fear behind her eyes whenever a call came from the school. She always defended him, insisting he was just struggling, that he'd straighten out eventually. I didn't argue with her, even when I doubted it quietly. There were good days mixed in there, though they became fewer over time. Days when he'd sit beside me on the porch, talking about dreams he didn't know how to chase. He told me once that he wanted to be something, though he never explained what that meant. I sensed a weight in him even then, a fear of disappointing our mother, a fear of not becoming the person she believed he could be. That weight didn't soften as time passed. It hardened into something sharper. As adults, we drifted into different worlds. I followed a predictable path: work, bills, responsibility, while he stayed tangled in uncertainty. But even then, I never imagined he was capable of anything truly harmful. I held tight to the thread of loyalty we'd been raised with, believing that no matter how far he wandered, he'd never step past a line he couldn't return from. That belief had anchored me through countless storms. Sitting in that hospital waiting room, replaying those memories, I felt something inside me shift. The note in my pocket suddenly felt heavier, as though the years leading up to this moment had been quietly nudging me toward a truth I never wanted to see. I wasn't ready to read it yet, Not because I feared the words, but because I feared what they would confirm about the boy I once knew and the man he had become. I didn't read the note again right away. Instead, I leaned back in the stiff hospital chair and let the hum of the fluorescent lights fill the silence around me. The scent of antiseptic drifted through the air, sharp enough to sting a little at the back of my throat. Something about that smell brought me back to a night years earlier, one I had tried hard to tuck away but could suddenly recall with painful clarity. I was 16 when I first sensed something was truly shifting in my brother. It was a small moment, almost forgettable, but it lingered longer than it should have. I had come home from school to find our mother pacing the living room, her fingers tapping anxiously against her thigh. She told me he hadn't returned from class and wasn't answering her calls. I remember the way her voice cracked, just slightly, like she was trying not to sound scared. He came home a few hours later with a story that tumbled out too quickly, edges frayed and details fuzzy. He said he stayed late for a project, but he didn't bring home supplies or books or anything that made the excuse believable. His eyes darted around nervously, never settling long enough to feel honest. I wanted to believe him. I always did, but something in his demeanor made my stomach tighten. It was the first time I saw that flicker of secrecy. After that day, little things started piling up, but none seemed big enough to confront him over. Money disappeared from a jar my mother kept in the kitchen drawer. She brushed it off as miscounting, but I noticed the pattern. He'd flinch when certain topics came up, especially anything involving responsibility. He grew defensive too quickly, his tone sharp even when no one was accusing him of anything. It felt like walking on shifting ground, unsure what might crack next beneath us. A few months later, our mother got a call from the school. I was sitting at the table doing homework when the phone rang. Her expression changed almost instantly, her hand tightening around the receiver. She didn't say much, just listened, but the tension in her shoulders told me enough. When she hung up, her voice was calm, but her eyes gave her away. He'd been caught lying about missed assignments, skipping classes, spending time with kids known for getting into trouble. She told me not to worry, that teenagers go through phases, but she didn't look convinced. That evening, when he finally walked through the door, there was a heaviness about him. His backpack sagged, the zipper half open like he hadn't bothered with it. He looked at our mother for just a moment before glancing away, avoiding her disappointment. She didn't raise her voice. She simply asked what happened, and he responded with another excuse, one that sounded practiced yet hollow. I remember watching her eyes dim, not from anger, but from fear that she was losing him in ways she didn't understand. As the year went on, the tension became more noticeable. He grew quiet around us, slipping away to his room the moment he got home. At dinner, he'd push food around on his plate, barely eating before muttering that he had homework. Sometimes I'd hear him pacing in his room late at night, boards creaking beneath his restless steps. Other times, he'd sneak out through the back door long after our mother had gone to bed. I'd hear it, lying awake, wondering if I should get up and stop him, but I never did. I think part of me was afraid of becoming the enemy in his eyes. We'd always been close growing up, close enough that calling him out felt like a betrayal of its own. So I kept quiet, hoping things would settle on their own. But they never did, not really. The warnings were small, almost quiet in the grand scheme of things, but they chipped away at the trust one had in him. Still, every time I thought about confiding in our mother, I'd see the exhaustion in her face, and the words would die before leaving my mouth. He had a way of making her believe the best in him, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. He'd apologize with a softness that made it hard to stay upset. He'd promise to do better, promise he understood, promise he wouldn't slip again. And for a brief moment it looked real. But it wasn't long before he'd fall back into old patterns, pulling our mother's hopes down with him every time. Looking back, I realized how many moments I brushed aside. The lies that came too easily, the excuses that didn't align, the subtle manipulations that made our mother feel guilty for being worried. I had told myself he was struggling, that he needed support, that he would grow out of it eventually. I wanted to believe that because the alternative was too painful to consider. Sitting in that hospital waiting room, with the weight of his unread note pressing against my chest. All those memories came rushing back with a clarity I hadn't felt before. They weren't isolated incidents. They were early warnings I had ignored, signs of something deeper and far more complicated. And though I didn't yet know what the note contained in full, I finally understood that whatever it held wasn't sudden. It had been building quietly for years, beneath the surface, waiting for a moment like this to rise. I sat there in the waiting room, letting the old memories settle around me like dust drifting through a sunbeam. It was strange how easily the past could surface when the present felt too heavy to face. My brother sat a few chairs away, hunched forward with his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly like he was bracing himself for something. I watched him for a moment, trying to reconcile the man he was now with the boy I used to defend without hesitation. The distance between us felt wider than the space in that room allowed. There was one moment from our late teens that lingered more than any other, one I had spent years trying to justify or reinterpret. It happened just after my 18th birthday. Our mother had planned a small dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta and a cake from the grocery store where she worked. She had even bought paper plates with little balloons printed on them, smiling through her tiredness as she set the table. My brother was supposed to pick up the cake on his way home. It was a simple request, something he'd agreed to easily. He showed up almost 2 hours late. No cake, no explanation. His clothes smelled faintly of smoke, and his eyes had that same restless darting pattern I'd learned to associate with trouble. Our mother tried to hide her disappointment, insisting the meal was still special, but the hurt was visible in her tight smile. I remember feeling a flare of anger, sharp, unexpected, and impossible to ignore. When I confronted him later, he brushed it off with a careless shrug, saying he got caught up. He didn't apologize. He didn't even seem to understand why it mattered. But the part that stuck with me most wasn't the missed cake. It was what I found the next morning. His jacket had been tossed over the back of the couch, pockets half inside out. A crumpled receipt peeked from one of them. It wasn't for a cake. It was for gas station snacks, a pack of cigarettes, and a prepaid phone card. I stared at that receipt longer than I should have, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and resignation. I never confronted him about it. I just threw it away and told myself it was better to keep the peace. That pattern, him taking advantage of our mother's trust and my silence, seemed to repeat itself over and over again as we moved into adulthood. Whenever he made a promise, there was always a chance it wouldn't hold. Whenever our mother needed something from him, he found a way to avoid it or pass it on to me. And every time, she made excuses, choosing to remember the kind-hearted version of him she believed still existed underneath the turmoil. There was another moment years later that I knew I should have taken more seriously. Our mother had slipped on ice outside a store and twisted her ankle badly. The doctor advised her to rest, to avoid putting any pressure on it. She needed help around the house, small tasks like lifting groceries, moving laundry, taking out trash. My brother promised he'd handle it, swearing he was stepping up. For 2 days he did. Then, without warning, he just stopped showing up. He stopped answering her calls. I drove over after work to find her sitting on the couch, trying to fold laundry because she didn't want to bother either of us. That night, when he finally texted, all he wrote was, "I've been busy." No apology, no explanation, just busy. The small betrayals built a wall around us slowly, brick by brick, until I realized I no longer knew how to trust him completely. I still loved him. Love doesn't disappear just because trust erodes. But I learned to brace myself whenever he entered a room. Around our mother, he played a version of himself that appeared devoted, burdened, misunderstood. She clung to that version, seeing him through a lens polished by years of hope. But I saw the cracks. I saw the inconsistencies. And I saw the moments when he looked at her with guilt that flickered before settling back into practiced calm. Even so, something inside me always wanted to give him another chance. Maybe it was loyalty, maybe habit, maybe the memory of the boy who used to follow me around the yard with skinned knees and wild ideas. But sitting in that hospital waiting room, I could feel an unmistakable truth nudging its way to the surface. Those early warning signs weren't isolated mistakes. They were patterns, ones I had learned to ignore out of fear of what it meant to face them honestly. I shifted in my chair, feeling the cold stiffness of the plastic press against my back. My hand drifted to my jacket pocket, brushing against the folded note. The paper felt warm from my body heat, yet every time I touched it, a chill crept up my spine. My brother didn't look at me directly, but I could feel his tension radiating through the space between us. He knew I'd read it eventually. He also knew that once I did, there would be no going back to the comfortable version of our relationship we had maintained for years. The memories kept circling, replaying themselves with new weight. And now, sitting there with the sterile hospital lighting buzzing faintly overhead, I understood something I hadn't before. The note wasn't going to reveal something sudden. It was going to confirm something old, something that had been waiting patiently in the shadows of our history, gathering shape with each moment I tried to overlook. Whatever he had written, whatever truth he felt compelled to share on the morning of our mother's surgery, it wasn't born from nowhere. It was rooted in years of quiet fractures. And I felt, somewhere deep in my chest, that reading it would change not just the day, but everything that came after. I didn't sleep that night. Not even for a minute. I kept replaying every conversation, every glance, every memory of the past 2 years like my mind was a projector stuck on fast forward. The way he seemed nervous lately, the way he kept his phone face down, the sudden late nights at work, all the little things I brushed off because love makes you believe in the best version of people, even when the truth is quietly rotting underneath. By morning, I felt the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones. Heavy, cold, and strangely clarifying. I made a decision. I needed the truth. Even if it hurt. Even if it destroyed everything. Even if it meant confronting the possibility that the life I had built was based on something fragile, fraudulent, or incomplete. When my husband came downstairs for breakfast, he acted overly cheerful. Too cheerful. His smile looked like someone had drawn it onto his face with a marker. "Morning," he said, kissing my head as if we were the picture-perfect couple. I watched him, really watched him, the shake in his hands, the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his eyes avoided mine. He knew something too. Maybe he sensed my suspicion. Maybe he felt the air between us shift. Maybe he knew that the walls he had built were thinning. "What time did you get home last night?" I asked casually, pretending to stir the sugar into my tea. He froze, but only for half a second. To the untrained eye, it would have been invisible. But I had spent years studying this man. I noticed everything. "Late," he said lightly. "Work ran long. You know how it is." I nodded. "Sure." But inside, the words twisted like a knife. Work ran long. The same line he used last Tuesday, and Thursday, and the Saturday before that, except his office was closed on weekends. I couldn't confront him. Not yet. I needed facts, not feelings. Proof, not paranoia. So I continued the game. The pretending. The smiling. The nodding. It was a performance neither of us believed, but both of us maintained. Around noon, I told him I needed to run errands. He offered to come along too quickly, too eagerly. He was afraid to leave me alone. That was new. That was suspicious. "No, it's fine," I told him. "Just groceries and some returns." He hesitated. "You sure? Positive?" I smiled sweetly, grabbed my keys and drove off. But I wasn't going to the grocery store. I drove to the place where the stranger from the previous night had shocked me with that single, terrifying sentence. "You deserve to know the truth." The place he told me to meet him. A quiet parking lot near an old, abandoned shopping center. Cold air flooded in as I stepped out of the car. There wasn't a soul in sight. The fog made the entire area look like something out of a crime thriller. I hugged my jacket close and scanned the lot until I saw a figure approach. It was him, the stranger. But the moment he got close enough for me to see his face clearly, the breath was snatched from my lungs. He wasn't a stranger. I recognized him instantly because I had seen him years ago, in photos my husband kept hidden in a separate folder on his laptop. A folder he thought I never found. A folder labeled with a name I didn't recognize then. But now I did. Daniel. Not a friend. Not family. His brother. A brother my husband told me was dead. A brother he insisted had passed away long ago. Yet here he was, alive, breathing, standing in front of me, and looking at me like he had waited years for this moment. "You know me now," he said softly. I swallowed hard. "You're supposed to be dead?" he finished. "Yeah, that's what he told you." My chest tightened, and a chilling wave washed through me. "Why?" I whispered. "Why would my husband lie about something like that?" The man, Daniel, looked at me with an expression that made my stomach flip. Not pity, not anger, something worse, something deeper. "Your husband didn't just lie," he said. "He buried the truth because the truth would destroy everything he built. Everything he told you. Everything you think you know about him." My heartbeat pounded so loudly I could barely hear his next words. "He kept me hidden because he was afraid you'd find out what he really did." My knees weakened. What he did? Daniel took a breath, steadying himself, as if he knew the next sentence would shatter me. "He didn't push me away because we argued. He didn't cut me out because of a family dispute. He cut me out because I discovered something huge, something dangerous. And when I confronted him, he made sure no one would ever believe my side of the story." "What story?" I asked, my voice small and trembling. The wind blew a cold gust between us. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The story of who your husband truly is." And just like that, everything inside me collapsed. The ground shifted. My reality blurred. Because the look in his eyes told me one thing. Something I wasn't prepared for. Something I didn't even want to consider. My husband wasn't just lying. My husband was hiding a past dark enough to bury someone alive. And he almost succeeded. The morning air was still heavy with fog as I stepped back into my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. My thoughts spun faster than the wipers clearing the faint drizzle on the windshield. I couldn't stop replaying Daniel's words. "Your husband didn't just lie. He buried the truth because he was afraid you'd find out what he really did." My chest ached. My stomach churned. And yet there was a strange clarity in the chaos. I needed proof. I needed to see it with my own eyes, to touch it, to hold it, because if I didn't, it would all seem like a nightmare I imagined. I drove toward the address Daniel had given me, an old storage facility on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that smells faintly of dust, mildew, and rust, an odor that clings to your clothes and hair no matter how far you go. I parked in a dim corner, the tires crunching over gravel, and the fluorescent lights inside the facility flickered weakly as I stepped through the door. The place was empty except for a few stacked lockers, the hum of the overhead lights filling the silence. Every sound I made echoed unnaturally, amplifying the tension that had built in my chest all morning. Daniel met me halfway down the row, his eyes scanning the space like he expected someone, or something, to appear at any moment. He gestured toward a locker at the very end. "It's all there," he said. His voice was low, cautious, as if the words themselves could trigger consequences. My hands shook as I approached, the combination of fear, adrenaline, and curiosity making each step feel heavier than the last. I could almost feel the past years pressing against my back, memories of him and my brother blending with the present in ways that were impossible to separate. The locker door was cold under my fingertips as I tugged it open. Inside, stacked neatly, were folders, envelopes, and binders, documents that belonged to my husband but had been kept secret from me and from our mother. I pulled one out and felt the weight of the paper, the crispness of the typed letters, the faint smell of ink. My hands trembled as I flipped it open. The first pages were financial records, accounts I didn't recognize, bank statements in my mother's name, forged signatures, and unexplained withdrawals. The handwriting in some places was familiar, my brother's, but the intent was unmistakable. Someone had been hiding, manipulating, and stealing under the guise of trust. As I dug deeper, my stomach dropped further. There were emails printed out, conversations between my husband and another man I had never met, discussing arrangements, transfers, and keeping it under control. My heart raced as the realization hit me. This wasn't just a hidden past. This was a network of lies that spanned years, calculated carefully to make discovery almost impossible. Each folder I opened revealed more. Receipts, altered bills, notes about dates and amounts. My mother's name appeared repeatedly, tied to expenses she had no knowledge of. The betrayal wasn't only emotional. It was financial, legal, and deliberate. I leaned back against the locker, trying to process the magnitude of what I was seeing. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed louder, almost accusatory. My hands were clammy. My heart raced like it was trying to escape my chest. Daniel watched me quietly, the tension in his body mirrored in mine. I could see he understood the gravity of my reaction. He hadn't needed to explain further. The proof was overwhelming. It screamed the truth louder than words ever could. The documents forced me to recall every suspicious moment I had brushed off. My mother asking him for help with bills that were suddenly missing, unexplained late nights, sudden debts that seemed to vanish into thin air. Everything aligned now. The small lies, the evasions, the tension in our home, they weren't minor lapses or youthful mistakes. They were calculated, and they had been happening for years. I found a folder with personal notes, entries my brother had written, detailing attempts to intervene, to uncover what had been done, and to protect our mother before I ever knew. Reading them, I felt a strange mix of anger and sorrow. He had tried to shield us from the worst of it, from the full truth, until it became unavoidable. The irony was brutal. The person who had betrayed us most had also been the one keeping us from even knowing it sooner. My emotions twisted in knots. Resentment, grief, guilt, and relief all at once. My hands clutched the papers tighter, pressing the information against my chest as though holding it physically could anchor me. Daniel's voice broke the silence. I didn't know how to tell you. I wanted to make sure you saw it all before anyone else got hurt. His eyes held a quiet urgency, but also a weariness that mirrored my own. I swallowed hard, realizing just how far the deception went. This wasn't simply a lie between siblings. It was an intricate web that involved my husband, my brother, and even my mother, who had unknowingly been caught in the crossfire. The betrayal was deeper than I could have imagined. And now, holding the evidence in my hands, I knew there was no going back. Whatever came next would have to be deliberate, careful, and intelligent, just as this deception had been. I left the storage unit clutching the folders, my chest tight but my mind sharpening. For the first time that morning, I felt a strange clarity amidst the storm of emotions. I knew what I had to do, not impulsively, not violently, but smartly. The first step toward reclaiming control had begun. Back in my car, I sank into the seat, letting the folders rest on my lap. The papers felt heavier than any weight I had ever carried. Yet at the same time, they grounded me. The cold air from the vents mixed with the lingering fog outside, and I realized I hadn't even noticed the sun breaking through. Everything in the world felt sharper. The light, the air, the quiet hum of the engine. Every sense seemed heightened, as though the universe itself wanted me to pay attention to what I had discovered. I flipped through the folders again, this time more deliberately, searching for details that could explain the full scope of what had been hidden. Receipts, letters, emails, bank statements, and handwritten notes revealed patterns that were impossible to ignore. My brother had been acting as both a protector and a manipulator, hiding certain truths while covering up others. The deeper I dug, the more it became clear. The deception wasn't impulsive. It was meticulous, precise, and calculated over years. The web of lies stretched across finances, relationships, and trust in ways I could hardly comprehend. My hands trembled slightly as I traced the lines of text, noticing familiar handwriting, the small quirks that made it unmistakable. It hit me that every time I had felt uneasy, every time I had sensed that something wasn't right, I had been correct. The note my brother had handed me at the hospital had been only the beginning, a trigger pointing to years of secrecy that neither our mother nor I had been aware of until now. I felt a mixture of sorrow and outrage rise in me, heavy and inescapable. I thought about my mother and the surgery she was undergoing. The idea that she had unknowingly been part of this deception, that she had trusted both her children to act responsibly, tightened something deep in my chest. My mind flashed to small moments. Her asking for help with bills, her trust in us both, the way she had smiled and reassured me even when the house carried an invisible tension. She had been caught in the middle of something I hadn't fully understood. And now, knowing the truth, I could see how much she had unknowingly carried alone. There was one set of documents that made me pause. A series of financial transfers, some legitimate and some suspicious, suggested that my brother had been moving money in ways that could have serious consequences. Certain entries were marked with dates that coincided with times my mother had asked for help. Yet the funds had vanished without explanation. My mind raced as I tried to trace the logic, to understand the reasoning behind these actions. It felt like a puzzle deliberately designed to confuse, delay, and obfuscate. I thought about confronting him, about demanding answers. But the more I considered it, the more I realized that anger alone wouldn't solve anything. He had been careful, methodical, and cunning. A hasty reaction could jeopardize everything, including my mother's safety and the stability we had left. I needed to plan, to act thoughtfully, to uncover every piece of this puzzle before making a single move. The weight of responsibility settled over me like a mantle, heavy but necessary. The afternoon sunlight shifted across the dashboard, painting faint lines across the folders. I noticed a particular email thread that revealed coordination between my husband and someone else, someone my brother had apparently tried to shield me from. The words were polite, clinical, almost mundane, but the intent behind them was unmistakable. It wasn't just deception. It was manipulation, a game played quietly behind the scenes to maintain appearances while actions unfolded unchecked. The realization made my stomach churn, and I gripped the steering wheel harder, feeling both fear and determination rising together. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge a small truth. My brother's note wasn't a warning only. It was a plea. He had handed me the first piece of evidence, trusting that I would understand the gravity of the situation. The moment I accepted that, a strange calm settled over me, almost like a mask hiding the storm underneath. I knew I had to move forward, but carefully, deliberately. Every step from this point would have to be calculated, measured, and intelligent. I drove slowly back toward the hospital, the folders stacked on the passenger seat beside me. Each turn, each stoplight felt amplified, a beat in the rhythm of a day that had begun like any other, but now felt monumental. My mind replayed every discovery, every inconsistency, and every betrayal. The realization was unavoidable. This wasn't just a family dispute. It was a complex web of lies, manipulation, and hidden truths that had taken years to construct. And now it was mine to untangle. As I pulled into the hospital lot, I let out a slow breath, steadying myself against the adrenaline and fear. The waiting room, the fluorescent lights, the antiseptic air. I was back in the same space where everything had begun that morning. Yet nothing felt the same. The weight of knowledge pressed down on me, yet beneath it, a faint spark of resolve flickered. I wasn't just a passive observer anymore. I had seen enough to act, and acting wisely, without haste, would be the only way to navigate the storm that was coming. I returned to the waiting room with the folders still on the passenger seat, the papers shifting slightly with every step I took. The hospital had a quiet hum, punctuated only by distant footsteps and the occasional murmur of a nurse calling a room number. My heart thumped in rhythm with the fluorescent lights above, and I could feel the weight of every second pressing down on me. Sitting back in the chair, I placed the folders on my lap and looked toward the hallway where my mother had gone in for surgery. Her absence made the space feel emptier than it had that morning, but it also heightened the tension, like the air itself was waiting. I realized my brother had not moved from his seat. He sat a few chairs away, hands clasped between his knees, staring down at the floor with a strange rigidity I didn't recognize. He hadn't offered an explanation or tried to engage me since handing me the note. The silence between us had stretched so long that it felt like its own presence, thick and heavy. I wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but I also understood that he was likely waiting, just like I was, for something. Maybe courage, maybe permission, maybe forgiveness. I opened one of the folders again, scanning the financial records with renewed focus. Certain entries, previously overlooked, now jumped out at me. Transfers that coincided with times our mother had needed money, unexplained deposits to accounts neither of us recognized, notes scribbled in the margins that hinted at conversations he had with people I didn't know existed. The pattern was unmistakable. My husband and my brother had coordinated these actions carefully, making sure nothing could trace back to them. The betrayal felt bigger than I had imagined, stretching beyond my personal trust into a realm that felt criminal and dangerous. My brother shifted slightly, finally meeting my eyes. There was a flicker of hesitation, a subtle plea for understanding, before he looked away. His gaze was no longer familiar. It was cautious, almost guarded. I realized then that he had been preparing for a reaction like mine for years. He knew that once I uncovered these secrets, nothing would ever be the same. My emotions twisted. Anger, disbelief, and a deep sense of loss collided in my chest. I wanted to shout, to accuse, to demand explanations, but I knew doing so would not bring clarity. It would only escalate the tension and possibly endanger my mother before she even came out of surgery. Time seemed to slow as I continued to sift through the papers. A receipt caught my eye, one that indicated a large sum withdrawn from an account I thought was safe. The handwriting on the accompanying note was unmistakably my brother's, but the purpose was obscured. He had clearly tried to cover it up, to make it look like an ordinary transaction, but the intent was visible if you knew what to look for. My pulse quickened. The betrayal was not just emotional, it was strategic. Every step had been planned, every move considered, every detail orchestrated to maintain the facade. The silence between us was interrupted by the faint beep of the elevator. I looked up briefly as a nurse passed, wheeling a cart laden with supplies. The ordinary sounds of the hospital contrasted sharply with the extraordinary revelation that sat in my lap. The calm, clinical environment made the tension feel even more surreal, like we were caught in a quiet storm that no one else could see. I realized that for the first time, I wasn't just processing betrayal. I was understanding the full scope of what my brother and my husband had orchestrated over the years. A thought struck me sharply. If they had gone this far without my knowledge, how much more could there be? What else had been hidden, manipulated, or altered to protect their secrets? My mind raced through every small inconsistency I had noticed in the past. Every time my husband's explanation had sounded too smooth, every time my brother's excuse seemed off, the realization settled in like a stone in my chest. This was bigger than I had ever imagined, and it wasn't over. My brother's subtle movements drew my attention again. He seemed tense, but not defensive, almost apologetic, but not in words I could hear. His eyes met mine briefly, and I sensed he wanted me to see that he had tried to shield us all in some way. Yet the folders in my lap contradicted that notion entirely. He had protected us selectively, yes, but at the same time had enabled deception on a scale I could barely comprehend. The conflict inside me intensified. Part of me wanted to reach out, part of me wanted to pull back entirely. The minutes stretched on, slow and deliberate. Each tick of the clock on the wall felt like a drumbeat, reminding me that the surgery and the consequences were still unfolding. My fingers tightened around the folders, the edges cutting faintly into my palms. I knew that once my mother came out, everything would shift again. There would be questions, emotions, and choices to make. But at that moment, the most important thing was to process what I had learned, to acknowledge the betrayal, and to prepare for the next steps without letting fear dictate my actions. I exhaled slowly, letting the air fill my lungs and then release in a measured sigh. The storm inside me hadn't calmed, but the edges were sharper, more focused. I wasn't powerless. I had the evidence. I had the awareness. And now I had to plan, carefully, intelligently, because the next move would determine not just what my mother would see, but the kind of person I chose to be in the face of betrayal. The waiting room felt smaller as the minutes dragged on, each tick of the wall clock marking a second I could never get back. I kept my eyes on the elevator doors, expecting my mother to emerge any moment, fragile from surgery and unaware of the storm that had quietly unfolded around her. My hands rested on the folders, the papers now slightly bent from my constant flipping, yet the information they contained felt like armor. I realized then that knowledge, painful as it was, gave me control. A control I hadn't felt in months, perhaps years. My brother shifted in his chair again, barely perceptible, but enough to make me glance up. His eyes met mine, a flicker of guilt or fear, maybe both, passing through them. He was trying to communicate something without words, the kind of silent plea that speaks volumes. I understood it perfectly. He had brought the note for a reason. He had helped me uncover the truth, but he couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. I felt a mix of gratitude and frustration, an impossible combination that left me tense and alert. I reviewed the folders again, focusing this time on the correspondence between my husband and the third party Daniel had mentioned. The emails were polite, almost casual, but the content was chilling in its intent. Arrangements, plans, and timelines for hiding money, erasing records, and controlling narratives leapt off the page. The scale of the deception was staggering, and I felt the weight of every missed warning, every overlooked detail, settle like a stone in my chest. How had I been so blind? How had I allowed trust to grow over lies so deeply entrenched? A nurse appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand, and my stomach tightened. She glanced at me, giving a small nod, and I realized my pulse had quickened without my awareness. I pushed the folders onto my lap, gripping them as if they were a shield. My brother noticed my tension and mirrored it subtly, his hands gripping his knees so tightly that the veins in his wrists were visible. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us could. Words would have been too weak for the storm raging quietly between us. Then, a murmur down the hall. The elevator opened and I saw her, our mother, walking slowly, her steps supported by a nurse's arm. She looked smaller than usual, her face pale from anesthesia, but her eyes were steady, full of relief at seeing me. Relief that I tried to meet with a soft smile, though it barely touched the tight knot of fear and anger inside me. My mother's hand reached for mine instinctively, and I took it, noting how fragile she felt. The reality of the moment hit me. She had survived surgery, but the truth we were carrying could shake her world just as violently as any illness ever could. I tucked the folders out of view, realizing that they couldn't be revealed yet. Not here. Not while she was weak. My mother's grip was warm but frail, and I felt the responsibility settle heavily on my shoulders. I had to protect her from the worst of it for now, even as my mind raced with plans and calculations. The betrayal, the evidence, the truth, it was all there. But patience, careful timing, and strategy were the only tools I could use without causing irreparable harm. We walked slowly down the hallway together, each step echoing softly against the sterile tile. She leaned on me slightly, and I felt the weight of both her body and the trust she placed in me. My brother followed a few paces behind, silent but present, a living reminder that the family I had thought I knew was fractured more deeply than I had realized. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and flowers from the small vase in the waiting area. It was ordinary, mundane even, and yet the tension simmering beneath it made every sensory detail sharp and almost unbearable. As we approached a small sitting area near the recovery rooms, I noticed subtle changes in my brother's demeanor. He was restless, shifting weight from one foot to the other, glancing at me briefly before looking away. He was waiting for me to take action, to decide what to do next. I understood instinctively that he was both ally and caution, a guide through the treacherous terrain of the deception we had uncovered. But he had no control over the timing, only over how much of the truth he had allowed me to see so far. I finally exhaled slowly, feeling the tight coil of adrenaline inside me relax just slightly. The room, the hallway, the fluorescent lights, all of it was still ordinary, still familiar. But my mind was racing, thinking several steps ahead, mapping out possibilities, anticipating responses, calculating consequences. The betrayal was massive, yes, but so was the opportunity to act deliberately, intelligently, and without causing harm to the person who mattered most, our mother. I looked at her fragile form and felt a surge of resolve. The notes, the emails, the hidden accounts, all of it would be dealt with, but not recklessly. Not today. Today I would protect her. Today I would plan. And when the time came when I could act with full knowledge and strategy, I would ensure that justice, subtle and deliberate, would be served in a way that she and I could survive without losing more than we already had. The hours passed slowly, each one stretching longer than the last. I stayed close to my mother, watching her recover, her face pale but steady under the soft hospital lights. Every time she shifted or winced, a tight knot formed in my stomach. Surgery was supposed to leave her weak but alive. Yet I felt a strange new responsibility pressing down on me, protecting her not only from physical harm, but from the truth I had uncovered. The weight of knowing the deception, the lies, and the betrayals was almost suffocating. My brother sat quietly across from me, occasionally shifting in his chair, his eyes flicking toward the folders on the table beside me. He was restless, tense, as though every heartbeat reminded him that the game we were caught in was far from over. I understood. He had been complicit in secrecy, sometimes unwillingly, sometimes deliberately. But he had handed me the note, and that had changed everything. Now he was both participant and cautionary figure, a witness to the storm that was about to unfold. I couldn't stop thinking about the emails and receipts we had found earlier. Every one of them hinted at deception far more intricate than I had imagined. Money moved between accounts in ways that were almost untraceable, excuses layered like wallpaper over the truth, and subtle manipulations designed to keep both our mother and me in the dark. The betrayal was not casual. It was deliberate, intelligent, and chilling in its precision. The realization made me tense, my pulse quickening with both fear and determination. I noticed my brother's hands fidgeting again. He was avoiding eye contact, but I caught glimpses of worry and guilt in his expression. He had tried to shield us in some ways, but in others, he had enabled the lies to continue. I couldn't bring myself to speak yet. Words felt inadequate, too direct, too dangerous in the stillness of the hospital. Instead, I watched him, noting the subtle tension in his jaw, the way he shifted weight from one foot to another, the faint tremor in his hands. These small tells gave me insight into how fragile our dynamic had become. The nurse came by, checking vitals, moving efficiently through the room with a calm professionalism that contrasted sharply with the tension in my chest. I noticed the faint scent of antiseptic mixing with the residual warmth of my mother's presence. The ordinary sounds of the hospital, footsteps, monitors, soft conversation, felt surreal against the extraordinary revelations of the day. I realized then that nothing about this morning would feel normal again. Nothing could erase the weight of what I knew. At one point, my mother dozed, her hand still lightly resting in mine. I felt a surge of protectiveness, a determination to act not impulsively but strategically. I couldn't allow anger to cloud my judgment. I needed every piece of evidence, every detail, every fact before confronting anyone. The betrayal, though clear, had to be met with intelligence. One wrong move, one misstep, and the situation could spiral, harming the very person I was trying to protect. I glanced at my brother again. He avoided my eyes, but the tension radiating from him was palpable. I wondered how long he had known how deep the deception went. Had he been aware of the financial manipulations? Had he seen the emails and just stayed silent? I realized that the note he had given me was a calculated decision, a controlled release of truth, designed to guide me without letting the situation spiral out of control. That thought both frustrated and reassured me. Then, without warning, my mother stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at me and smiled faintly, exhaustion and relief mingling in her gaze. I squeezed her hand gently, careful not to alarm her. The weight of the truth pressed against my ribs, but for a brief moment, I let myself focus solely on her, drawing strength from her fragile presence. The folders beside me remained untouched, a silent promise that the truth would be revealed on my terms, not hers. I thought about the next steps. Confrontation would come, but not now. I needed time to process, to plan, and to gather every detail before taking action. The stakes were too high. The betrayal was too extensive. And my mother's safety, both physical and emotional, was paramount. Every strategy one considered involved precision, patience, and the ability to act without emotion clouding judgment. The reality was that knowledge alone was not enough. Execution mattered. As I sat there, the hospital quiet around us, I felt a cold clarity settle in. The evidence, the deception, the lies, they were all pieces of a puzzle I had to solve carefully. My brother remained silent, his presence both a reminder of the betrayal and a guide through it. The tension between us was almost physical, a quiet electricity in the air, signaling that the situation was far from resolved. Every decision from this point on would matter, and I knew that intelligence, patience, and careful observation would determine whether justice or chaos came first. The sun dipped lower outside, casting long shadows across the floor. The room felt both still and charged, quiet and alive with anticipation. I pressed my hand over the folders, feeling their weight, and I realized that the next phase was inevitable. We had crossed a line that could never be undone, and the choices I made now would define the outcome. My mother's surgery was over, but a more complicated recovery had begun. One that involved trust, strategy, and the careful unraveling of secrets buried far too long. The next morning, I woke with a weight in my chest that made every movement feel deliberate and measured. The folders sat on the kitchen table at home, organized neatly, almost mocking me with the cold, undeniable evidence they contained. My mind replayed everything Daniel had revealed, every email, receipt, and note I had read in the storage facility. The realization hit me anew. The web of lies was far larger than I had imagined, stretching across years, people, and decisions that had seemed ordinary at the time. I sat down with a cup of coffee, the warmth seeping into my hands, trying to steady my thoughts. It was time to confront the full truth, not just the financial manipulations or the small betrayals, but the real motive behind them. Daniel's words had made it clear. My husband and brother had orchestrated these actions carefully, keeping me and our mother in the dark. But there was more. Something I hadn't fully grasped until I began tracing the connections across the documents. Patterns emerged, small at first, then unmistakable. I noticed the dates. Certain transactions coincided with moments when my mother had been vulnerable. Her surgery, her birthday, the anniversary of my father's death. The manipulation wasn't random. It was targeted, designed to maintain control over her life and decisions while hiding critical truths. The calculations, the timing, the foresight, it wasn't impulsive, and it wasn't a simple family dispute. It was deliberate, precise, and almost cruel in its patience. Then I found it. A single folder labeled in my husband's handwriting. My heart pounded as I opened it, and the truth revealed itself like a punch to the chest. Every major deception, every carefully constructed lie, was outlined here. He had anticipated questions, prepared answers, and built contingencies for any discovery. But there was one section that froze me in place. A detailed account of how he had manipulated events to hide his brother Daniel from our family, ensuring that his existence remained a secret for years. The extent of the deceit was staggering. My husband hadn't just lied. He had rewritten reality, constructing a narrative where I could never question him. Every word, every document, every conversation I had trusted over the years had been influenced by this hidden agenda. The betrayal wasn't emotional alone. It was comprehensive, a takeover of perception, trust, and family structure. I felt my chest tighten, the betrayal twisting deep inside me. I stared at the papers, trying to comprehend how someone I loved could have orchestrated such a long-term scheme. And yet, as I read, I realized something crucial. It had all been done with a certain fear. Fear of exposure, fear of losing control, fear of the consequences if the truth came out. My husband had constructed an elaborate web not only to deceive but to protect himself from judgment, and perhaps to protect the family from a truth he assumed they couldn't handle. Daniel's warnings echoed in my mind. Your husband didn't just lie. He buried the truth. Now I understood fully. The buried truth was no small secret. It had shaped our lives, decisions, and trust for over a decade. And the deeper I dug, the clearer it became that my brother had been caught in the middle, trying to manage both loyalty and morality, creating a tension that had finally culminated in the note he had handed me at the hospital. I remembered the morning of my mother's surgery, the way my brother had handed me that simple piece of paper. At the time, I had thought it was just a warning, a fragment of truth meant to prepare me. But now, with the full scope of documents before me, I realized it was a key, a starting point. The note had given me the first piece of evidence, enough to anchor me in the storm of deception, but not enough to understand the full picture. The twist, the revelation that had been hidden behind years of lies, now stood fully in front of me. My husband had manipulated not only our family but also my perceptions, building a structure of deceit that could crumble only if exposed methodically. Every lie, every omission, every act of misdirection had been intentional. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, intelligent, and meticulous. And yet, amidst the shock and anger, I felt a flicker of understanding. The fear that drove him to hide the truth, the complexity of the web he had spun, and the moral compromises my brother had made to navigate it all, these factors clarified, rather than excused, the situation. They gave me a framework to act within, a way to approach justice carefully and deliberately. The revelation was devastating, yes, but it was also the moment where control returned to me. I closed the folder slowly, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The full truth was now visible, undeniable, and permanent. It would shape the next steps I took, the decisions I made, and the strategy one would employ to confront the betrayal. The storm was no longer invisible, it was mapped out, tangible, and actionable. And in that clarity, amidst the weight of betrayal and the ache of trust broken, I found the first sense of resolve. This would be addressed, carefully, intelligently, and completely. The clarity that came with knowing the full truth was both terrifying and strangely liberating. I could no longer ignore the patterns, the manipulations, the years of deceit. But I also realized that anger alone would accomplish nothing. If I wanted justice or even closure, it would have to be careful, deliberate, and intelligent. I began to plan in my mind, reviewing the documents again, tracing each thread of betrayal, each lie, each manipulation, and envisioning how I could use this knowledge to reclaim control over a situation that had been stolen from me. I started by thinking about my mother. She had survived surgery, and she was vulnerable. Her trust had been manipulated repeatedly, and she had unknowingly been caught in the middle of their schemes. I had to protect her, ensure that she remained shielded from the worst of the truth until I could act strategically. The folders contained everything I needed, but revealing them prematurely could cause more harm than good. I made a mental list of priorities. First, safeguard my mother. Second, gather any remaining evidence I might have overlooked. Third, plan the confrontation in a way that could not be dismissed or deflected. My brother remained a silent observer, and I knew I could rely on him, at least partially. He had handed me the note at the hospital, signaling that he wanted me to understand, to take control. Now, in the quiet of our shared space, I realized he could be an asset, if he remained honest. I needed his cooperation, his knowledge, but I also needed to keep the ultimate responsibility in my hands. He had tried to protect us before, but his loyalty had been compromised by fear. I could not let emotion cloud judgment now. I began to lay out the folders on the dining table, sorting them into categories: financial, correspondence, and personal notes. Each stack represented a piece of the puzzle, and now I could see the connections clearly. Patterns emerged that I had not noticed before. Recurring accounts, consistent methods of deception, and subtle manipulations intended to maintain control. The precision was almost surgical, but now I had the scalpel. I traced the lines with my finger, noting the inconsistencies, the opportunities, and the vulnerabilities in the system they had built. Then I thought about confrontation. I would not yell, accuse, or act impulsively. That would only give them the opportunity to manipulate, to evade, to hide further. Instead, I began to script out the approach in my mind, envisioning every question, anticipating every excuse, preparing every response. I realized that control came not from force, but from meticulous preparation, from understanding every angle, from knowing the truth so thoroughly that deception could not survive. My mother stirred in the other room, and I paused, realizing how high the stakes truly were. She depended on me now more than ever, and the responsibility weighed heavily on my shoulders. I could not let this situation spiral out of control. Every move had to be calculated to minimize harm, to protect her, and to ensure that when justice was delivered, it was clean, precise, and undeniable. The thought of acting impulsively made my stomach twist. I could not allow myself or her to be blindsided by anger or emotion. I glanced at my brother again. His posture was tense, but his eyes now carried a flicker of understanding. He had seen me process the information, organize it, and anticipate the next steps. I could feel a subtle shift. He was no longer the one holding pieces of the puzzle to manipulate events. The initiative had shifted entirely into my hands. I had control, and with control came both power and responsibility. I mapped out a sequence. Gather any missing evidence, review everything thoroughly, confront my husband with precision, and then reveal the truth in a controlled manner. I would not be rushed. I would not act emotionally. The betrayal had been long, but so would be the unraveling, methodical, deliberate, and unmistakable. The satisfaction of knowing that I could approach this intelligently, rather than reactively, was strangely comforting. As the evening settled in, I felt a calm determination I had not felt since the morning my mother went into surgery. The folders were laid out, the evidence organized, the strategy forming in my mind. I had uncovered the truth, and now it was time to reclaim my agency, to navigate the consequences with intelligence and precision. The plan was clear, the evidence irrefutable, and the opportunity to act carefully had arrived. Revenge, subtle and deliberate, would no longer be a thought. It would become a strategy executed flawlessly. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of the day wash over me, but with it came focus. I understood now that justice was not about impulsive anger or confrontation. It was about preparation, patience, and execution. And with the tools and knowledge I had gathered, I was ready to proceed. The storm had arrived, and this time, I was the one holding the map. The morning light slanted through the blinds, dust motes dancing in the golden rays, and I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced in weeks. The folders lay neatly on the kitchen table, each stack organized and labeled, a physical manifestation of the plan I had been building in my mind. I had decided that revenge, or more accurately justice, would not come from shouting, confrontation, or impulsive anger. It would be subtle, deliberate, and surgical. Every move I made had to be measured, every step carefully executed, so that the truth would unfold without ambiguity. I started by reviewing every email, receipt, and note again, looking for vulnerabilities, gaps, and weaknesses. The more I examined the patterns, the more I realized just how fragile the entire structure was. Years of deception had created a network of lies so intricate that one misstep could have collapsed everything, or exposed me to unnecessary risk. But now, I had the pieces aligned, and I could see the threads connecting each act of betrayal, each manipulation, each attempt to control perception. It was like walking through a maze I had once been blind to, but now I had a map. My brother sat across from me, quieter than usual. I could see that he understood the plan without words needing to be exchanged. His eyes flicked occasionally toward the folders, then back to me, a subtle acknowledgement that he would follow my lead, but only as an observer, not the orchestrator. I needed that clarity. He had been part of the deception before, and I would not risk letting his past complicity interfere with the precision of what I was about to execute. He would serve as a witness, a bridge between the past and the moment of truth, but I would be the one guiding the unfolding. The first stage of the plan involved my husband. I knew I could not confront him openly in anger. He was too clever, too practiced at hiding the truth. Instead, I decided to lead him into his own trap by revealing carefully curated pieces of evidence, enough to unsettle him, enough to make him reveal more than he intended. The folders contained everything. The emails, receipts, and notes arranged in a way that would allow me to control the narrative. Timing would be everything. I could not allow him a chance to manipulate the situation or shift blame. I also considered the financial evidence. By arranging it in a logical, chronological order, I could show him, and later my mother, the precise scale of the deception. Each transaction, each manipulated account, each forged signature would be undeniable. The plan was not about punishment in the moment. It was about exposure, creating a structure where the truth could not be ignored, and the consequences would unfold naturally. I felt a cold satisfaction realizing how meticulous the plan had become. I moved to the next phase, protecting my mother. She had endured surgery and was still fragile. The goal was not to overwhelm her, but to shield her while ensuring she eventually understood the full scope of the situation in a way that was safe and controlled. I decided that she would not see the folders until I had confronted my husband and established the boundaries of accountability. For now, she would remain unaware, resting, unaware of the storm I was preparing to unleash. Protecting her became part of my strategy, a constant reminder that justice did not need to be violent to be effective. Throughout the morning, I rehearsed every conversation in my mind. I imagined possible excuses, attempts at denial, and deflection from my husband. I prepared responses that would corner him, leave no room for manipulation, and expose the truth in a way that could not be twisted. The meticulous planning gave me a sense of control I had lacked for so long, and the knowledge that I could navigate this carefully, deliberately, reassured me. By late afternoon, everything was ready. The folders were organized, my strategy rehearsed, and my resolve steeled. I felt a quiet thrill in the precision of it all, justice delivered without violence, without rash decisions, only the weight of undeniable truth. I looked at my brother and saw the same mixture of fear and acknowledgement in his eyes. He knew the plan would unfold, and there was nothing left for him to do but watch and support when necessary. As the evening approached, I felt the calm before the storm, the tension that comes with impending revelation. I had been patient, deliberate, and intelligent in my preparation. Now the stage was set. The years of deception, the betrayals, the manipulation, they would all meet clarity. And I would be the one guiding it, subtle, controlled, and unwavering. The quiet justice I had planned would finally begin, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of empowerment that was not fueled by emotion alone, but by strategy, understanding, and the meticulous execution of truth. The days that followed were quieter than I had imagined, yet each one was heavy with reflection and careful observation. The confrontation with my husband had taken place exactly as I had planned. Calm, deliberate, and backed with undeniable evidence. He had tried to deflect at first, offering excuses and half-truths, but the documents left no room for denial. Every email, receipt, and note had been laid out like pieces of a puzzle, and for the first time he could not manipulate the narrative. The truth, meticulously organized, had stripped away the carefully constructed facade he had maintained for years. My mother was gradually introduced to the reality of the situation, but in a controlled and gentle manner. I chose my words carefully, giving her time to process each revelation, ensuring she never felt blindsided or unsafe. Her eyes, initially wide with shock and confusion, softened over time, filled with understanding and even relief that the truth was finally visible. I watched her regain strength not just physically after surgery, but emotionally, as she began to reconcile the years of manipulation with the support she had in me. Protecting her had been my first priority, and seeing her able to absorb the truth without fear or panic felt like a small victory, one that grounded me in the midst of the chaos. My brother remained a cautious presence in the background, aware that his role had shifted. He was no longer the keeper of secrets or a silent participant in deception. Now he was a witness, a support, and someone who had helped me navigate the storm without directly steering the outcome. I could see in his eyes a mixture of guilt and relief. Guilt for the part he had played in the deception. Relief that the truth was finally unmasked. Our dynamic had changed irrevocably, but it was a subtle shift toward honesty, accountability, and a shared understanding of the consequences of manipulation. As I reflected on everything, the magnitude of the betrayal became clear. It had been emotional, financial, and psychological, touching nearly every aspect of our family life. But I also recognized the strength it took to act thoughtfully, to gather evidence, and to confront the situation without resorting to anger or violence. The patience, intelligence, and careful execution had been as much a form of justice as any direct retaliation could have been. In fact, the measured approach made the resolution far more powerful than impulsive confrontation ever could. I thought about my husband, now aware that the foundation he had built on lies could not withstand scrutiny. He had been forced to face the consequences of his actions without a fight, without manipulation. The balance of power had shifted, not through aggression, but through preparation, clarity, and the weight of undeniable truth. I realized then that revenge, subtle and deliberate, was more effective when it was thoughtful rather than emotional. Every lie he had told had been met with careful counteraction, and that precision carried a satisfaction that anger alone could never provide. My mother and I began rebuilding our relationship in this new reality. Trust had been tested, manipulated, and broken, but it could also be nurtured carefully, piece by piece. Each conversation, each moment, was an opportunity to reinforce honesty and safety. I felt a renewed sense of purpose in our family dynamic, grounded in the understanding that truth, though painful, was the only reliable foundation for moving forward. The lessons of betrayal were harsh, but they had taught me the value of patience, strategy, and emotional intelligence. The experience changed me profoundly. I had been forced to confront deception at its most intricate and manipulative, to process betrayal from those closest to me, and to act with intelligence rather than impulse. I learned that power did not come from anger, confrontation, or retaliation alone. It came from understanding, strategy, and patience. By planning carefully, observing quietly, and executing thoughtfully, I had been able to reclaim agency in a situation where it had long been denied. Looking back, I realized the moral of the story was not simply about betrayal or revenge. It was about awareness, responsibility, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths without losing composure. It was about protecting those you love while holding others accountable, and about understanding that justice does not need to be violent to be effective. The situation could have spiraled into chaos, but deliberate action ensured resolution, clarity, and safety. Sitting in my quiet living room, I reflected on the journey. The morning my mother went into surgery, the note my brother handed me, the folders, the discoveries, the confrontation, and the careful unraveling of years of deception. It had been a journey through fear, anger, and betrayal, but it had also been a journey toward empowerment, understanding, and measured justice. I knew now that while the past could not be changed, the future could be navigated with precision, honesty, and intelligence. The storm had passed, but the lessons remained. I felt a deep sense of accomplishment, not from revenge itself, but from the way I had approached it, thoughtfully, strategically, and without unnecessary harm. The family had survived the revelation, and the truth had emerged stronger than the lies. And in that quiet realization, I found not only closure but also the knowledge that even in the face of betrayal, calm, deliberate action could restore balance, protect the innocent, and ensure that justice, subtle but undeniable, prevailed. This story isn't just about betrayal or revenge. It's about the importance of awareness and critical thinking in our relationships. Trust is a gift, but it's also important to notice patterns, inconsistencies, and warning signs before they escalate. By observing carefully, documenting facts, and acting thoughtfully, you can protect yourself and those you love without letting emotion cloud judgment. It also shows that justice doesn't have to be aggressive or harmful. Strategic, patient, and intelligent action can restore balance and reveal truth far more effectively than impulsive reactions. Finally, the story reminds us that open communication, transparency, and boundaries are crucial in family and personal relationships. Protecting your well-being while approaching conflicts calmly is not only smart, it's empowering. The lesson here: even in the face of deception, you can reclaim control, make thoughtful choices, and navigate difficult situations with clarity, wisdom, and integrity. If you've ever faced betrayal or felt the weight of secrets in your own life, you know how heavy it can be. Stories like mine aren't just about revenge. They're about awareness, courage, and reclaiming control when everything feels uncertain. If this story resonated with you, please like, comment, and share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear how you've navigated moments of deception or betrayal in your own life. And if you want to see more stories like this, real stories of hidden truths, difficult choices, and the quiet power of justice. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single one. Your support helps these stories reach people who need them most, and it keeps this community strong. Thank you for listening, and remember, even in the darkest moments, clarity and truth can guide the way.